Let's go to the Washington Commanders. This one's a little different, man. We're gonna fix the Commanders in just 5 minutes, 5 to 15 minutes. Washington, they were a Final Four team, right? And when you're putting your notes together, it's like, well, they could use a little of this, a little of that. We need a wide receiver too. O-line definitely needs some improvements. But overall, an outstanding year one for Adam Peters as general manager. Again, they made it to the NFC Championship. They exceeded all expectations. And last year, when they built their team, remember, you came into the season saying, hey, if everything works out, if it all comes together, the Commanders could be sneaky good. Well, the most important thing came together, which was Jayden Daniels looked like a superstar, future MVP candidate. He looked special. And then all those little, hey, we're going to bring in a Frankie Louvu and a Bobby Wagner and these one-off moves, these Tyler Biadasz moves that I think are, they stack up in free agency. That's what we're going to see in a couple weeks here. Some stacking up some of those second and third tier type of moves. They pay dividends sometimes, and that's, I think, what happened for Washington this past year.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you make that volume of moves, it just makes it very difficult to pin down what a team is going to be. They could all be upgrades, in which case you've taken a massive leap forward and you're going to be way better than people expected you to be. Or, they could all bust and then you got worse. If anything, you're terrible. Or more likely it's going to be somewhere in the middle and you end up somewhere in the middle. But Washington, like the overwhelming majority of those moves worked out, or more importantly, as you said, the biggest ones, like the biggest ticket items worked out. And in particular, Jayden Daniels was an absolute slam dunk. I mean, arguably the greatest quarterback rookie season that we've ever seen. And that's the kind of thing that will propel you into the playoffs and then even deeper into the playoffs when he's playing at that kind of level. But to me, so this happens every now and again. We saw it with Justin Herbert and the Chargers. What Jayden Daniels was able to do behind an offensive line that never looked particularly good on paper and was a real weakness going into the season on paper was incredibly impressive. I think a key thing to do, though, is to not let that fool you into thinking, well, we don't need to worry about the offensive line then. Jayden Daniels can work with this kind of group. We're good. To me, the biggest weakness on paper of this roster is still that offensive line. And now that Jayden Daniels is really good, the biggest thing I would want to do this offseason is, well, now let's really help him out and make sure that we don't stress that. We don't, put him under a ton of pressure, figuratively and literally, and let's try and really build up that group in front of him.
Yeah, and so it's an interesting spot because technically all the starters are coming back next year, but one of the starters, Brandon Coleman, third-round rookie, I think he had his struggles. And what happens a lot of times with tackles is they have their struggles in bigger games or against, better pass rushes. And I think that's what kind of happened with Coleman. He might actually be better fit to play guard. Andrew Wiley, probably on the lower end of starting right tackles. He's been serviceable through the years, but I think they could use an upgrade at either position. The interiors, not bad. Tyler Biadasz, again, came over from Dallas. I thought that was a really shrewd signing. Those are the types of signings I think that are the way to build the offensive line, like $10 million a year for Biadasz, right? Maybe bring in a James Daniels in free agency, those types of players. He's coming off an injury, but bring in a Morgan Moses at right tackle. Now that's a 1 year. It's a 1 year stopgap. This isn't perfect Morgan Moses territory. He's coming up later, but yeah, I think going back to the draft as well would be a smart move, and getting younger and continuing to build depth on that O-line for Jayden Daniels.
I mean, look, Sam Cosmi is a great offensive lineman, their right guard. Like, he's obviously their best offensive lineman. I think they could upgrade the other four positions, like, without too much of a problem. I know they just brought in Tyler Biadasz and they gave him decent money, but my point is the standard that they are at with the other four positions on that offensive line wouldn't be that difficult to upgrade any of the four. So in particular, I think tackles are the two biggest weaknesses, but you're looking at that group and you're like, Cosmi is set, right? For the next 5 years, you would expect Cosmi to be their starting right guard. Any of the other four could be a different name in the next 5 years, at which point you need to be looking at free agency and the draft. Like, you need to be hammering that in both. Even though they're under contract, it doesn't mean we stop looking for upgrades.
The chat's asking about Ronnie Stanley. I mean, he's the top tackle free agent. It's pretty much him and Cam Robinson as far as, I think Stanley's at a better spot, also not coming off of the big injury that, Cam didn't get hurt. I'm confusing him with Darrisaw down the stretch there. But the two tackles, Ronnie Stanley's definitely the best. I mean, every tackle needy team is like having that Ronnie Stanley discussion. Do we give him the big deal? And he's been kind of in and out of the lineup over the last couple of years. I would be fine with that. Either way, they have $80 million worth of cap space. They are one of these teams that they're blessed with the Jayden Daniels contract for the next couple of years. They can do some overspending. I think they're one of the teams probably that's in the Myles Garrett trade market. And so when we're looking at a team who was in the Final Four, they were supposed to be rebuilding this year, right, Sam? So there are offensive line questions. I think there's defensive line depth questions. There's questions in the secondary, especially cornerback 2. And then there's wide receiver 2, opposite Terry McLaurin. We got some good play from De'Ami Brown down the stretch, but they don't have a ton of players under contract at receiver. So like all of those things need to be ticked off, but they have the cap space to be able to make some power moves. And I think one of those is they're one of the few teams that I think could stomach a Myles Garrett draft pick trade plus the actual contract.
Okay. I'm here for that. I think you're right though, that they're one of those interesting teams where they have a ton of cap space in this year where free agency is generally absent those monster names, those big ticket items. The Stanley thing is interesting because at his best, Ronnie Stanley has been arguably the best pass blocking left tackle in the game, at this point, right? Since the retirement of guys like Joe Thomas, Stanley took over and looked like he was going to be the standard as a pass blocker at left tackle. And then he had that really bad injury that basically cost him 2 straight years. And when he came back, he's been good, but he hasn't been the level he was before that injury. So I think there's a lot, not only are teams having that discussion about, bringing in Ronnie Stanley, but I think they're also asking themselves, what is he now, right? Is he the guy that we saw last year, or can he get back to being the guy before the injuries? Like, have we seen a permanent reduction in the level that Ronnie Stanley can play at? Or are we simply witnessing like this long drawn out return to full health? Like if you knew you could get the kind of all pro caliber pass blocker Ronnie Stanley back, then I think it's absolutely that would be a position that I would go after if I'm Washington. Let's try and get a left tackle that will be not just serviceable, but like legit to pair with Jayden Daniels. And, there's one slight caveat to the Ronnie Stanley elite pass blocking stuff. There was always that question of, well, how much does Lamar Jackson impact that, right? Having a quarterback that you have to think about where he's going to be when you're rushing the quarterback. You can't just pin your ears back, tear around the edge and hope he's going to be there, because he won't be. So you actually have to change the way you rush the passer a little bit. Jayden Daniels is already in that same bracket, right? You can't just rush Jayden Daniels with reckless abandon. You need to think about what you're doing, because otherwise he's going to scramble and he's gone. So if you were like, well, Stanley's not quite as good as those numbers would suggest because of the quarterback, well, the quarterback would be similar in Washington in terms of also, applying that kind of boost to a pass blocker. So you would be getting the same level in those terms, because that variable should still be the same.
It's a great point, Sam, and it's probably one of the reasons. Remember last year, Baltimore went into the year, we were like, what are they doing on the offensive line, right? We don't know who's playing right guard. We don't know what they're going to do at right tackle. And they just went into the draft and they took Roger Rosengard in the second round, and he eventually became the starting right tackle. They opted into some question marks on the offensive line, I think in part because Lamar Jackson factor, right? And I think Washington has that type of force multiplier in Jayden Daniels, where you could probably do with a lesser offensive line from a pass blocking standpoint, because you have to worry about him scrambling, and from a run blocking standpoint, because he's going to be that, extra man. He's going to avoid a defender. But to your initial point on this whole thing, you have to tread lightly with that, right? That's how Seattle handled Russell Wilson for a while. They said, look, Russ is going to run around and make plays. We can deal with a lesser offensive line through the years. Even though they invested, they just didn't, hit on a bunch of players. They did feel like they didn't have to, overpay a ton for offensive line. So it's an interesting dynamic where that might be your schematic advantage. But I love the idea of bringing in a Ronnie Stanley, maybe moving Coleman, letting him compete at left guard, makes everything just a little bit better up front, continue to replenish through the draft. And the other thing, my weakness in all of these, Sam, is I tend to ignore injury history, or it's such an unknown. It's still like an unknown. So I'm a, big flashy name guy, and I'm more likely to push aside injury history when it comes to players. But Stanley was healthy last year and made it through the year.
Yeah, like I mean, it wasn't too long ago where you would be like, ooh, I don't know about bringing in Ronnie Stanley. That injury history is terrifying. Because it was the manner that it happened. It wasn't like anyone can have one bad injury and you're down and you come back. But it was the way he came back, played like a game, and was so clearly not able to go in that game that they basically shut him down for a whole nother year. And you're like, that sounds terrible. Like, that sounds career ending for an offensive lineman. That sounds like the kind of thing that does not easily recover. And yet he did come back and play, a full season and look good doing it. So I'm definitely a lot less concerned about that now than I was at some point. The other name I would bring up for Washington, though, is Alaric Jackson, who, early in his career was like the sort of the way that Jacoby Myers was the poster child for the problems of the New England receiving corps. Like, if he's your number one, this is a terrible group. And then Alaric Jackson was like the poster child for the Rams offensive line has fallen to rack and ruin. Look, their left tackle is Alaric Jackson. But actually, over his career, he's improved and gotten better and was pretty good last year. And, he feels like a really under the radar free agent name where he's coming to free agency, young, still improving theoretically. And he would be going from one quarterback who, Matthew Stafford he's not giving you that boost, right? No pass rusher is concerned about where Matthew Stafford's going to be when they're deciding what they're going to do rushing the passer. So he would potentially be getting that Ronnie Stanley boost that we talked about of all of a sudden his life's made a little bit easier by Jayden Daniels. Like, Alaric Jackson in Washington could actually end up being a really, really nice left tackle.
I like it. That's a good suggestion there. Let's go back to the defensive line here for Washington. Myles Garrett, do you think they're one of the teams that's at least in the mix? I mean, honestly, there's not a ton, I think, that are either feel like they're close, have the money to do it, and based off how I think the Commanders drafted really well last year, and because of that, maybe you can sacrifice a couple picks to make it all happen.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends what exactly that trade's going to look like, but sure, I would be perfectly prepared, particularly now that it's a low first-round draft pick. I'm all for the idea of flipping my first-round draft pick and maybe a couple of other bells and whistles for Myles Garrett, and then if you have to make him the best paid defensive player in the NFL to make that happen, you can absorb that because you have $80 million of cap space. You expect to be good right now. You're not massively concerned about his, drop-off decline arc, given that he's now pushing, the upwards of 30. That's when the decline tends to start for pass rushers. Like, you probably don't care about that for the next couple of years when you expect to be at your best with this young quarterback. So, yeah, I mean, Washington, I think, make the most sense of a team to be calling Cleveland and trying to make something happen.
Whether or not they go with Garrett, they're picking 29th, back end of the first round, and then 61st in the second round. So back end of the second, obviously. They're another team that if they doubled up on the defensive line, I wouldn't hate it, right? So this scenario, let's start. I want to talk D-line, but at cornerback, Mike Sanders still did a great job filling in as kind of, CB2 on the other side of Marshawn Lattimore. I would rather see Sanders still play in the slot. That's where he played at Michigan. I mean, he reminded me of Mike Hilton coming out. I think everybody had that type, not that comp, but that type of dude. Mike Sanders still is the type of nickel, energy guy on the defensive side of the ball. I think he could do that. I would love to see him play nickel. And so cornerback 2 is this, bring in a Travarius Ward, one of the top options, a DJ Reed, Carlton Davis, maybe. I think all of those guys opposite Lattimore. Are you a little fragile with some older corners with Lattimore and whoever you bring in? Maybe. I would love to see them solve that, though, in free agency and then get into the draft and maybe go double up on the defensive line late first and late second. Because, again, I think there's a deep enough draft, enough options there that they could really do some damage on the D-line in this draft.
Yeah, and I've even seen Lattimore talked about as a cut candidate as well. So, you might have an entire cornerback room essentially to replace or to build in this offseason. So, sure, Sanders still is really good. He can play outside if you need him to. But I think in an ideal world, they want 2 high-caliber starting corners that they trust, and they can put Sanders still back in the slot. One of those might be Marshawn Lattimore. They brought him over. He was injured a lot. He's been injured a lot. When he's been back, he hasn't looked anything like the player that he was early in his career, but who knows how much of that is the injuries at this point. either way, he's a pretty significant unknown quantity at this point. You've got guys like Benjamin St-Juste who just isn't at that high enough level. So, they could easily bring in two guys that they expect to start, right? And, there's a few of those available in free agency. A guy like DJ Reed from New York, from the Jets, would be a fascinating addition. I mean, he was quietly a really, really good player for them. All the attention went to Sauce Gardner on the other side, but DJ Reed was fantastic for the Jets as well. He would be a guy that you would really bank on just immediately coming in, solidifying one spot, and then reducing the number of concerns down to one.
Let's sign Reed in free agency. Let's do that for Washington.
Solid.
And then in the draft, I keep talking about the D-line, but here's the other scenario. Some of the top corners, Benjamin Morris, Siobhan Revell, both of those guys injured during the season. Will Johnson, of course, injured during the season as well. But I think Morrison and Revell in particular could be there late in the first round. Another one of those buy low. I think they're top 15 caliber players in this draft. And if the injuries have them dropping, love that type of pick for Washington in the late first as well. Maybe getting a top 15 player a little bit later in that later draft spot. I think those could be outstanding fits at corner. And then there's wide receiver too. Again, for a team that finished in the Final Four, it does feel like there's a lot more to fix or to make sure is in good standing heading into next year. Any thoughts on what they do there opposite Terry McLaurin?
I mean, it's obviously an area they could stand to strengthen. I don't feel like it's as big a need as I would imagine. Wide receiver 2 is going to be most people's top or second need for Washington this offseason. I don't think it's that big a deal. If you can find an upgrade, absolutely. But like the combination that they've had there has been perfectly serviceable. McLaurin and Daniels are like the important variables there. Yes, you absolutely want additional weapons, and the more you get, the better the offense is. But like I feel like you have bigger weaknesses to worry about than wide receiver 2 on this roster. Absolutely draft somebody, grab a guy in the mid rounds, look to that sort of not second wave, but like look to the second tier of free agents. Like there will be serviceable players that can come in and be useful. Like we mentioned Greg Dortch, right? Greg Dortch, not necessarily a wide receiver 2, but a really useful slot option for the Cardinals. A very good player that can absolutely improve a receiving core in the whole. If you end up with Terry McLaurin, Greg Dortch, you draft somebody, like you're building a wide receiver core that's going to be perfectly serviceable.
The chat's suggesting maybe cut candidate Christian Kirk from the Jags, reunited with Cliff Kingsbury. And then I wanted to bring up Cooper Kupp. There's a couple landing spots that I think a Cooper Kupp fit would make sense. I do think this is one of them. I'll talk about New England later. I think there's a great fit there. But I like pairing Kupp with these rookie quarterbacks as a good route runner who's going to be, I think, still able to get open and do some damage against zone, against man when needed. Again, injury aside, how much does he have left? I think Kupp might be a good option. It sounds like you wouldn't lean that way, though. Maybe address some of these other options, D-line, corner, offensive line. And when you stack those up, it does push wide receiver 2 down just a little bit. I agree with you there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying you're not going to bring in a Cooper Kupp, particularly if he ends up being a cut option as opposed to just a trade option. But like this is part of why having $80 million cap space is a useful thing. It means you can be opportunistic, right? You can prioritize whatever. But if a guy like Cooper Kupp suddenly becomes available, or it becomes a deal that you're willing to do from a trade collateral standpoint, like you have the cash to absorb that easily as well. So yeah, to me, wide receiver 2 is a lower priority than it is for other people. I would definitely prioritize, offensive line, secondary. Let's rebuild that defense. But I'm not saying like don't do anything at wide receiver 2 if something emerges that you think makes a ton of sense. I just think that's an easier fix than like we got to go, prioritize a really high quality, high price wide receiver 2.
We've given some options to Washington. Have we fixed the Washington Commanders? DJ Reed, drafted in the trenches and drafting corners. We're drafting all the good players. Commanders fixed.
Thanks for watching all the way to the end of our video.
For more great content, click here to subscribe and here to watch another video. We'll see you again soon.